Thomas bought his first home in Melbourne in 1978. He was 26 years old. He had been working as an electrician for 4 years. He had saved enough for a deposit, not a large sum, simply what 4 years of steady work produced when a man was careful with money. He walked into a bank on a Tuesday afternoon, sat across from a man in a gray suit, and left with a mortgage approval. 3 months later, he owned a 3-bedroom brick house 15 kilometers from the city center. The purchase price was just under 3 times his annual income. Thomas did not consider this an achievement. He considered it unremarkable. His older brother had done the same thing 2 years earlier. His father had done it in the 1950s. His colleagues at work were doing it. Buying a house was not a milestone. It was simply what happened when you worked steadily for a few years and did not spend recklessly. Now consider Anna. Anna is Thomas's granddaughter. She is 26 years old. She has a university degree. She works full-time as a project coordinator and earns more than Thomas ever did, in real terms, adjusted for inflation. She's been working for 5 years. She has savings. She has good credit. She has done everything the financial advice columns recommend. She cannot buy a home, not a large home, not a modest home, not any home within a reasonable distance of where she works. The median dwelling in Melbourne now costs more than 13 times the median income. The deposit alone would take her approximately a decade to accumulate. And by the time she accumulated it, prices would have moved again. Anna is not financially irresponsible. She is not making poor decisions. She has followed the same logic Thomas followed in 1978 and arrived at a categorically different outcome. The question this video examines is not whether that outcome is unfair. The question is why it happened, and whether the mechanism that produced it was accidental. It was not. To understand what changed between Thomas and Anna, you need to understand what housing was before it became what it is now. For most of the 20th century and most developed economies, a house was a consumption good. Its value was its utility, shelter, stability, a place to raise children. Prices were loosely tied to local incomes because housing was financed conservatively. Loan-to-income ratios were constrained. Interest rates were regulated or capped. Banks lent what borrowers could demonstrably repay. Credit was the limiting factor, and credit was tight. This was not because governments were especially virtuous. It was because the institutional memory of the 1930s remained alive. Depression-era bank failures, mass foreclosures, families displaced. These memories shaped regulatory frameworks that kept housing finance conservative for decades after the war. In that environment, housing prices could not run far ahead of incomes. Not because of planning, because of arithmetic. If the amount you can borrow is constrained by what you earn, the price a seller can extract is constrained by what buyers can borrow. Prices and incomes stayed connected. That connection began to break in the 1980s. The deregulation of lending standards in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia did not happen in a single moment. It happened in stages through legislation that was presented as expanding opportunity. In the United States, the Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980 lifted interest rate ceilings. The Garn-Saint-Germain Act of 1982 deregulated savings and loan institutions. Mortgage lending became more competitive. Lending standards began to loosen. In the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher's right to buy policy in 1980 allowed tenants to purchase council homes at steep discounts. Over the following 2 decades, more than 2 million public housing units were sold. That stock was never replaced. The government had converted its affordable housing supply into private assets and declined to rebuild what it had sold. In Australia, negative gearing, a tax policy allowing property investors to deduct rental losses against their taxable income, was expanded and entrenched. A 50% capital gains tax discount introduced in 1999 further tilted the tax code toward property speculation. The system began rewarding people for holding property rather than building things. None of these policies were presented as mechanisms for making housing unaffordable. They were presented as expansions of opportunity, ways to democratize wealth, to give ordinary people a stake in the economy. When you make it easier to borrow money to buy a house, you do not make houses cheaper. You make them more expensive. Every additional dollar of credit that enters a housing market is absorbed into prices. This is not a theory. It is how asset markets function. When demand increases and supply is constrained, and a housing supply is always constrained because land is finite, planning approvals take years, and construction cannot scale instantaneously, prices rise to absorb the available credit. The people who already owned houses when credit expanded became wealthier, not because they worked harder, not because they produced anything additional, because they were standing in the right place when the money arrived. Once housing prices began rising faster than incomes, the logic of the market changed fundamentally. If prices are rising, a house is no longer simply shelter. It is an appreciating asset. It is a store of wealth. And once housing is understood as an asset rather than a necessity, every participant in the market reorients accordingly. Banks have an incentive to lend more. Higher prices mean more valuable collateral. More lending means more revenue. Governments have an incentive to allow prices to rise. Higher property values generate higher tax revenues. They also generate wealthier voters. In every developed democracy, homeowners vote at higher rates than renters. Any politician whose policies reduce house prices is transferring wealth away from the majority of voters who own property. Existing homeowners have an incentive to resist any policy that might lower prices. Their retirement security, or in many cases their entire net worth, is tied to their property. A 20% fall in house prices is not an abstraction. It is a direct reduction in their financial security. Institutional investors, pension funds, private equity, real estate investment trusts began allocating capital to residential property. Housing is stable. It generates consistent rental income. Once housing became a recognized asset class, it attracted institutional capital that had previously gone elsewhere. Once all these actors are aligned around rising prices, the system becomes self-reinforcing. Higher prices attract more capital. More capital pushes prices higher. Higher prices justify looser lending. Looser lending pushes prices higher still. This mechanism does not correct itself. It amplifies. The historical record on housing asset inflation is extensive and consistent. Japan's residential property market peaked in 1989. At its height, the assessed land value of central Tokyo was said to exceed the assessed value of all real estate in California. Residential property in major cities reached 30 times annual income. The collapse that followed was not a correction. It was a generational event. 2 decades of falling or stagnant prices, millions of households trapped in negative equity, an entire generation of workers who purchased at the peak and spent their middle years underwater. Japan's economy has never fully recovered the dynamism it possessed before that decade. The United States in 2008, Ireland, Spain. The mechanism is identical in each case. Credit expansion, rising prices, a collective assumption that prices could only continue upward, and then the arithmetic of debt reasserting itself with consequences that fell most heavily on those least positioned to absorb them. What distinguishes the current situation from these historical episodes is its simultaneity. The Dutch tulip mania was Dutch. The Florida land boom was American. The Irish property bubble was Irish. The current housing affordability crisis is occurring in Melbourne, Sydney, Auckland, Toronto, Vancouver, London, Amsterdam, Dublin, Stockholm, and Seoul at the same time, at similar rates despite different zoning regimes, different immigration levels, different construction industries, different regulatory frameworks. A phenomenon that is simultaneous and global cannot be explained by causes that are local and idiosyncratic. The shared variable is not population growth. It is not zoning. The shared variable is the coordinated expansion of mortgage credit that began in the 1980s, the coordinated reduction in interest rates that followed, and the coordinated conversion of residential property into a recognized institutional asset class. There is a political mechanism that explains why reform has been structurally impossible. In most developed democracies, between 60 and 70% of households own their home. These households vote. They vote at higher rates than renters. Their primary financial asset is their property. For many of them, property is their retirement plan, their children's inheritance, their financial security. Any policy that would meaningfully improve housing affordability would, by definition, reduce the price of existing homes. Mass construction of public housing increases supply and reduces prices. Land value taxation reduces the incentive to hold land for speculation. Restrictions on investor purchases reduce demand. Each of these policies, if implemented effectively, transfers wealth from existing owners to prospective buyers. The people who own existing homes will not vote for that transfer. They will organize against it. They will attend planning hearings. They will remove politicians who threaten their asset values. This is not corruption. It is democratic representation. The structural problem is that the majority acquired its interests under conditions, credit expansion, low interest rates, institutional demand, that were not available to the generation now locked out. The result is that housing policy in every developed country follows an identical pattern. Governments announce concern about affordability. They implement first home buyer grants, shared equity schemes, subsidized loans. None of these policies reduce prices. All of them increase demand. Several directly transfer public funds into the pockets of existing owners by pushing up purchase prices. The announced goal is affordability. The operational effect is price support. These are not the same thing. The burden of this system falls with arithmetic precision on those who were born too late. In 1980, the median age of a first home buyer in Australia was 25. Today, it is 36. In the United Kingdom, it was 27. Today, it is 34. In Canada, it was 25. Today, it is 35. The delay is not caused by changed preferences. It is caused by the requirement to accumulate a larger deposit relative to income, to wait longer for prices to become accessible, or to wait for parental assistance or inheritance. More than 60% of first home buyers under 30 in Australia received financial assistance from parents in a recent Reserve Bank survey. The ability to purchase a home is increasingly determined not by income but by parental assets. If your parents own property, you have a pathway. If they do not, the pathway is substantially narrower. Home ownership rates among young adults have declined across every developed economy. In the United Kingdom, home ownership among adults under 35 fell from 59% to 34% in a single generation. These are not incremental shifts. These are structural changes to the terms under which an economy allocates its most fundamental necessity. The macroeconomic consequences extend beyond individual households. A 2019 study by economists Changtai Xie and Enrico Moretti estimated that restrictive housing policies in high-productivity American cities had reduced national GDP by more than 36% relative to a counterfactual with more mobile labor. The distortion is not marginal, it is structural. There are three possible resolutions to the current situation. None of them is without cost. The first is indefinite continuation. Prices continue rising. Home ownership becomes progressively hereditary, accessible primarily to those who inherit wealth from property-owning parents. This is the current trajectory in several major cities. It requires no active policy. It requires only the continuation of existing conditions. The second is controlled deflation. Prices fall gradually over decades, managed through policy. Existing owners lose wealth slowly. Prospective buyers gain access gradually. This requires political leadership willing to tell homeowners that their asset will not appreciate indefinitely. No major developed democracy is currently pursuing this path. The third is disorderly correction. Credit contracts, prices fall sharply. Households with high loan-to-value ratios enter negative equity. Banks face impaired loan books, economic activity contracts. This is what happened in the United States in 2008, in Japan after 1990, in Ireland in 2010. The aftermath of each episode was not a reset. It was years of contraction concentrated among those least able to absorb it. History offers no example of a housing asset inflation resolving without one of these three outcomes. The question is not which is preferable. The question is which is arriving. Anna does not describe her situation as a systemic failure. She describes it as her situation. She has adjusted her expectations. She rents. She contributes to superannuation. She does not plan for property ownership the way Thomas planned for it, as a near-term certainty. She plans for it as a distant possibility dependent on variables outside her control. What Anna does not know, what very few people in her position have been told, is that her situation is not the result of her choices. It is the result of a sequence of policy decisions made between 1980 and today that converted the asset she needs to live in into the investment vehicle that others hold. That conversion was not inevitable. It was chosen through tax policy, through credit policy, through the accumulated effect of democratic majorities protecting existing asset values. And the conversion, once made, has proven structurally resistant to reversal. There is a question that sits beneath all of this that almost no politician will answer directly. What is a house for? If it is a place to live, its price should remain within reach of ordinary income. It should not appreciate faster than wages. It should not function as an asset class. If it is an investment, then prices must keep rising. Access will continue contracting. Wealth will continue concentrating. These two purposes are mathematically incompatible. A house cannot simultaneously be affordable and perpetually appreciating. Every policy framework that attempts to honor both is, by arithmetic, honoring neither. The choice was made. It continues to be made. The consequences are accumulating. Leave a comment with this question. Between Thomas in 1978 and Anna in 2024, the same city, the same aspiration, the categorically different outcome, at what point in that timeline do you think the decision was made that produced the difference? I read every comment. The answers shape what this channel examines next. The median price in Melbourne is still rising. The deposit Anna needs is still growing. The gap between what she earns and what a house costs is still widening. That is not a market finding its level. That is a system operating exactly as it was redesigned to operate. The only remaining question is when the arithmetic stops being deferrable. The intergenerational dimension of the system deserves precise examination because it is the dimension most consistently omitted from public discussion. In the United Kingdom, the total value of inheritances is projected to exceed £100 billion per year by 2035. In Australia, the intergenerational wealth transfer over the next 2 decades is estimated to exceed $3 trillion. These are not figures representing wealth that was created during that period. They are figures representing wealth that was accumulated through property appreciation that was itself a product of the policy environment described earlier. The implication is specific. The children of property owners will inherit assets inflated by 4 decades of credit expansion and institutional demand. The children of renters will inherit nothing from that inflation. They may inherit other assets, but they will not inherit property wealth because their parents did not accumulate property wealth. This is not a natural outcome of differential effort or differential talent. It is the direct output of a policy framework. The tax concessions that made property speculation profitable, the credit expansion that drove prices up, the political resistance to reform that kept them there. These were policy choices. Their wealth consequence is being transmitted to the next generation as though it were the natural result of merit. Thomas did not intend this for his granddaughter. He did not design a system that would lock her out. He made reasonable decisions within the framework available to him in 1978. Those decisions, multiplied across a generation of homeowners making similar reasonable decisions, produced a system whose secondary effects were not examined in public before they became entrenched. The system is not the result of bad intentions. It is the result of good intentions operating within incentive structures that produced outcomes nobody announced in advance. The tax concession that was supposed to expand rental supply concentrated it. The first homebuyer grant that was supposed to help buyers pushed prices higher and helped sellers. The credit expansion that was supposed to democratize home ownership concentrated it among those who got in early and priced out those who came later. This pattern, policies announced with one purpose, operating with a different effect, is not unique to housing. It appears across financial history wherever the incentive structures of politics, finance, and asset markets align around the same outcome. The alignment here is near total. The financial sector earns from rising prices. The political system earns from rising prices. Existing owners earn from rising prices. The only parties who do not earn from rising prices are those who do not yet own, and they are the ones who need the asset most urgently. There is no precedent in financial history for that alignment correcting itself from within. Every correction in the historical record came from outside the system: a credit contraction, a demographic shift, a regulatory intervention, a loss of confidence in the asset. The system does not reform. It continues until an external force changes the conditions under which it operates. That is where the analysis of Thomas and Anna leads, not to a prediction of when the external force arrives, to a description of what the system is, how it was built, and what the historical record suggests about its eventual trajectory. The external force that ends an asset inflation never announces itself in advance. It is identified in retrospect, in the examination of what changed and when. This channel exists to perform that examination before it becomes retrospective. To read the architecture of the system while there is still time to understand what it means. The Reserve Bank of Australia has published data showing that the ratio of housing prices to household incomes has increased by approximately 400% since 1980. Not 40%, 400. That is not a market responding to scarcity. That is a market responding to the systematic injection of credit and the systematic removal of political constraints on price appreciation. Tokyo provides an instructive counterpoint. Japan introduced a more aggressive property tax system and maintained stricter lending standards relative to several other developed economies. Tokyo, a city of 14 million people, builds more housing per year than the entire state of California. Its prices, while high, have not detached from incomes at the rate observed in Sydney, London, or Vancouver. The outcome is not accidental. It is the direct consequence of a different policy architecture. Different choices produce different results. The current outcomes in Melbourne and elsewhere were not inevitable. They were chosen. Anna knows none of this in technical detail. She knows the deposit figure. She knows what she earns. She knows the arithmetic does not resolve in her favor regardless of what she does with the variables she controls. She has accepted this as her condition, rather than as the consequence of identifiable decisions made by identifiable institutions over identifiable decades. That acceptance is itself a consequence of the system, a system that produces an outcome through the accumulated effect of policy decisions, and then presents that outcome as the natural state of the market, depends on that acceptance to remain stable. The moment the mechanism is visible, the moment the connection between the policy decisions and the housing prices and the locked-out generation becomes legible, the acceptance becomes a choice rather than a default. That visibility is what this analysis is for.